Every game at its core is essentially a bunch of boxes participating in a bunch of systems, at the very beginning prototyping stages, often literally. It is the context that gives real meaning to what we do, that actually brings emotions and connects us to the experience. Now, really, it is not my place to say what you want your game to be about, because, well, it's your game. What I can do, however, is provide some important tips for you to keep in mind regarding a game's fantasy and its themes. As a quick disclaimer, a lot of times the terms fantasy, context, and theme are used interchangeably, but I personally prefer to use themes in a different manner than the other two. I'll explain why later in the video. But first, let's talk about fantasy and how it relates to systems. There's a pretty famous article by Soren Johnson regarding mechanics providing meaning, that uses Ticket to Ride as the primary example. If you don't know Ticket to Ride, in short, it is a game about placing trains on railways, and the player who has the most successfully connected routes wins. So it feels like you play as different railway companies competing to provide the best rail service. But in the manual, the story is that all players are actual friends who have a wager regarding who will visit the most cities in 7 days. Now here the mechanics and context don't mesh well at all. A coined term, ludonarrative dissonance, is usually used to describe this sort of thing. The story of Ticket to Ride is about traveling in a limited amount of time, but mechanically speaking there is no strict time limit, and you can place trains at any position on the map, so there is no travel aspect in gameplay. Ticket to Ride is still an amazing board game, and it so happens that this particular example doesn't actually hurt it much due to the skippable nature of the story in the manual. But in video games, context is usually more upfront, so you have to think really carefully about it. What you're doing and why you're doing it have to gel really well. And this applies to abstract games too. For example, the developers of Threes have spent a lot of time thinking about how to contextualize their puzzle in a way that makes sense logically speaking. But it is even more true in games with heavy focus on narrative. Broadly speaking, it is going to be incredibly weird if you have a fast-paced action shooter about a pacifist who is absolutely against violence. Keep asking yourself, how does everything you build make sense in context? And like everything in game development, it's honestly not a case of one area being absolutely more important than the other. Both gameplay and context must work together to achieve something great. And this is where we get to themes. So if by fantasy and context I mean what the systems and mechanics are wrapped in, themes are what questions you would like to discuss in your game at a deeper level, if any. This sort of thing has to be decided pretty early on so you can build the mechanics holistically alongside your themes. If you want to take a look at some part of human nature, or relationship, or the effects of industrialization, or redemption, or whatever you have in mind, pre-production is the time to decide that. Otherwise, it can be really tricky to imbue meaning late in development, because the game was not built around having any of it. An example I often give is Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons. I'm not going to spoil and discuss it here in detail, I just want to mention that holistically, Brothers is built around the notion of trust, and everything in the game, from core mechanics to level design to narrative, all builds up to the final segment. It has resonated with many, and that's because it's something that existed as a goal in one shape or form in the game's production process from the get-go. So when you're planning what game you want to make, don't just focus on the mechanical game part. Focus also on the contextual why part, and think about what themes you would like to discuss so you could lay the foundation for them early enough. Thank you all for watching, and a special thanks to my patrons for their continuous support. If you'd like, feel free to join the campaign at patreon.com/Farlands. And regardless, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click on the bell button. I'll see you next time.